This message is called The Danger of Being Silent. The danger of being silent. A certain minority group had reasonable standards and things were getting better and better. And I was about 20 years old and I read this book. And the guy in the book said that all of a sudden the welfare state was kicking in a lot of places, and he elaborated. And all of a sudden you had a lot of women having babies out of wedlock, and let's say in previous decades they wouldn't have christened those babies, and there was a little bit of what I call pushback from the clergy in most churches about that. And then all of a sudden the clergy started noticing these greater numbers, and they thought, well, if I say anything, I'll discourage these people from attending, and as the basket goes around, there'll be less people putting money in. And he said the clergy got silent. And he said they might have made a big difference. And he said it's destroying the family structure. Now that was like 50 years ago, a little over 50 years ago, actually. Now that is happening to the general public. I mean, everybody. And a lot of the clergy are seeing what I call trends that are not good for family values, et cetera, et cetera. I can elaborate, but much of the clergy has gotten silent. They will say, well, we don't want to discuss things that are too political. We don't want to say anything because we might offend somebody, which means you might lose money. I mean, think of it from their point of view. And I want to say that that's really not good for society in general. If you're in the clergy, you see a trend that's negative, you should speak against it. Let's take abortion. For instance, if I were to go back 50 years ago, I would say, at least as far as I could tell, most churches would have been against abortion and they would discourage it. Most would have. And that would have at least held back a fair number of women from doing it. Now, a large chunk of the churches are silent on it. They'll say, well, that's politics. I'll offend people if I say anything. Let me tell you how abortion is bad for society. What we now know is that in most Western nations, because they've devalued motherhood, family values, and fatherhood, and they've exalted abortion as a wonderful thing for women, the birth rate is way below replacement level. And since those countries are dying out, well, they can replace them with immigrants. Yes, but it won't be the same. It's not quite the same country. And actually, it hurts the economy, too. Just give you one small example. Of course, Social Security, if the ratio, I think it was really a high number for every retiree when they first started Social Security. So it was no big problem. Well, now, of course, birth rates are so low, and at least a good chunk of the population lives longer, it's getting pretty tight. And the day could come where we could have 2 people on Social Security for every 1 worker. Don't laugh. It is a possibility, unless we have out-of-control immigration. It is a possibility. It hurts, and other programs it hurts too. I'm going to give you the Toys R Us story. I may have told this already, but it's maybe worth telling one more time. Toys R Us was pro-abortion all those years. And last year they went bankrupt. There's a big corner store where our kids used to love to go in there, and grandkids. It's gone. It's a big empty store now. Do you realize they helped kill off many of their future customers? Think about it. If any company should have been against abortion, it should have been Toys R Us. Oh, we are politically correct. They didn't think about it. You're killing, and maybe some churches are doing the same thing. They don't realize it. Well, being silent in the face of danger is a bad thing. Like if an army's in the field, you have sentries who are supposed to move around and keep looking so they don't get surprise attack. And in some armies, like I know the Russian and German army for certain, in Napoleon's army, if they caught you a sentry sleeping, you'd be shot on the spot. You know, officers of the day are supposed to go out there and inspect it. See that everybody is alert. You know, well, that's what would happen. Well, God's true prophets put a lot of their prophecies in writing. And we believe the reason they were put in writing is so they would stand as a message for all of us. You realize as we get closer to the end time, the messages that were written by prophets like Ezekiel and Isaiah are also for our time, too. I realize God, when he's ready, will speak directly to some prophets, you know, the two witnesses. But in the meanwhile, those words in the prophets are for us to warn America and warn the world about certain dangers. Because what they did in ancient times, they had walls around the cities and they had watchtowers at the corners, and they put a watchman in the watchtower. And that's the prophet is being put in that example. When he saw danger, he sounded the alarm, and they put guards on the wall and closed the gate and prepare for battle. Well, also, the Bible used the analogy of the watchdogs as well, the guard dogs. And if you have a guard dog who doesn't bark when danger is approaching, what use is he, right? So I'm going to read Isaiah 58:1. We'll eventually make some points, hopefully. Isaiah 58:1 and 2. Isaiah says, "Cry aloud and spare not." The reason I mention the word spare not, a lot of church clerics would say, but you can't talk about certain issues. You'll offend people. But when Isaiah, he was talking obviously to Israel, but the principle applies. When he says, cry aloud and spare not, that means even if it hurts people's feelings. And I would even say to a woman who's had an abortion, well, God can forgive you. It's not an unforgivable sin. But we should try to discourage others from doing what you did. And it's not good for, it's really, actually it's not good in a lot of ways. We'll get into them all now. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Tell my people their transgressions, the house of Jacob their sins. And then he goes on and say, they pretend to be so religious, but they weren't really. So God says, be bold and spare not. Ezekiel 3:17 and 19. This also is the same thing is said in Ezekiel 33, another context. Ezekiel 3:17. Son of man, I've made you a watchman for the house of Israel. So you're there on the watchtower, kind of watching for bad things to warn Israel about. Of course, he's speaking of spiritual things. Therefore, hear a word from my mouth and give them warning from me. When I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, in other words, because you're doing bad things, and you give them no warning, in other words, you're too nice and polite, you don't want to offend them, you say nothing. You give them no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life. That wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at your hand. In other words, he was telling Ezekiel, whether they like it or not, you got to tell them the truth. You think of someone like Jeremiah, who started as an 18-year-old boy from a priestly family. God told him to go to the temple and tell, which would include probably some of his own relatives and elders, you folks are wrong in Judah. You're going in a pagan direction. And he said it. Think of the courage that took. And actually, some of his own family members turned on him when you read Jeremiah closely. That took courage. And God told me, Jeremiah complained a few times to God. I said, if you think this is bad, anyway, he said, buck up. I'm with you, and that's all that counts. But God says warn them, even if it's not popular. Verse 19, yet if you warn the wicked, and he does not turn from his wicked ways, nor from his wicked ways, he shall die in his iniquity, but you have delivered your soul. In other words, he's telling Ezekiel, I'm with you. Tell them what they ought to hear, whether they want to hear it or not. Now, the Bible does say this. Actually, it says it about 5 times in the book of Proverbs. I didn't write them all down, but you can find them easily. Between Proverbs 15 and 20-something, God says, foolish people do not like admonitions. They just turn on you. So as far as our personal warnings, you have to kind of decide, is a person mature enough that they can handle it or not? Sometimes it's best not to say anything to them because they just can't handle it. And that's kind of a personal judgment thing. Although maybe they need to hear it anyway, but that's a personal judgment thing. But if you see a friend about to get an abortion or their child, you should speak up. And this one is really unpopular, but I'm about to shack up. I mean, that's the term they used to use when I was young. And at least the good Baptist ministers, as I remember, discourage people from living together without marriage. Now, I know they've diluted marriage so much that almost everybody does it now. It's this one guy was saying, they mentioned it last night, I think they mentioned it on the podcast. This guy says, I have a number of people that work for me, and I'm the only one who's living with his wife. The rest of them, and that was probably a true story, by the way. So I know it's popular, but you realize the problem with everything God said has value. You just can't see it. Humanly speaking, I can see the logic. Well, I'll live with this girl for a couple years, and then if I don't like it, then I'll move on, live with another girl for a couple years. And I can see where humanly that's appealing, right? Well, some of you. But you can see how humanly it sounds like good advice. But here's part of the problem with it. If they have a baby, that baby has no committed father. And that is a disaster for society. But there are other bad things about it, too. Actually, I don't think it's good for women. I don't know if women realize that. I'm giving my opinion, of course. I know a lot of feminists would disagree with me, tell me I'm old-fashioned and stupid, but I believe it's not good for women either, even though they all say it is. I don't think we should be silent. You should discourage people from doing that. So get married first. Make a commitment. I realize marriage is being chopped down by legal decisions. That's unfortunate too. Isaiah 56:10. Isaiah 56:10. His watchmen are blind. They're all ignorant. In other words, they don't really know what they should know. They're dumb dogs. They cannot bark. They cannot bark. Sleeping, lying down, loving to slumber. In other words, Isaiah's telling the clergy of Israel, as they're getting ready to go into captivity because of their bad behavior, he's saying, you all, instead of being watchdogs, you're dumb dogs. You don't know danger is coming, and you don't even bark. Danger is coming at us spiritually, and you're not even barking. You're laying there silent. And a guard dog who's silent is nothing, like a sentry in an army who's not watching. It's a disaster for society. Being silent also implies you agree with things that are going on. Doesn't that imply that? You agree with anti-family things that are going on. And most Western nations are in that problem. And also, there's another danger, socialism. There's actually a great book called the Black Book of Communism, and written by two French scholars. And they outline all the people killed by communist governments. Not in war, that's a separate category. Not in war. Governments killing their own people. Like Joseph Stalin had what we would call a government-managed famine that killed 2 to 7 million. They can't decide whether it's 2 million or 7 million. It was so chaotic. Starved to death for some of his programs. And when his wife complained about it, at least we believe he had her shot. Now, the official government thing was she committed suicide, but he started burning her with cigarettes. People saw that, and the next day she was shot. He said suicide. He probably had the secret police do her in. That's a true story. People, he had a very attractive wife, and she thought she could influence him for good when she heard about the starvation. It's not like Stalin didn't know. You just weren't allowed to say those things. Mao did something even worse. They killed a lot more Chinese, but I won't go into it now. In other words, socialism is dangerous. Everywhere it's been tried, it has backfired in one way or the other. All socialist governments, they disarm the public. By the way, Hitler was a socialist government too, National Socialist Party. He and Mussolini were socialists. Maybe they were a different type of socialist than the communists, who were their rivals in socialism, but they all were socialists. They disarmed the public. Venezuela, same thing. Nobody can have guns. That way, if they need to push the people around, they can do it more easily. Actually, if you want to read a real sad tale, Russia had something called the food police. It was a mob of men that they gave guns to, and they went through some of Russia's best farmland. Any farmer that was too prosperous, they named a kulak. They did horrible things to them, stole their food, and they meted out the food to only certain people. In other words, communism, instead of peace and bread, it was starvation and a police state. It was a whole series of gulags managed by the communists in Russia that's unbelievable if you read how bad it was. And Hitler had a series of death camps too, but actually Stalin's killed 3 times as many as Hitler did. And most of the world doesn't know that. A Virginia legislator said, Virginia is now totally in the control of the far left in America. He said, so what did they do? They put draconian rules on churches. And they tried to ban all guns in Virginia. And they were short just a few votes because of a big demonstration, but they're going to keep trying until they get it. Then they're talking about using the National Guard to take people's guns away in Virginia. That's scary business. Think about how scary that is. So you're going to say, well, ministers shouldn't say anything about that. I think they should. Socialism is a threat to religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. You compare how blue state governors handle churches and red state governors, it's almost like night and day. Maybe not purely night and day, but almost. Gives you some idea of what would happen if they gain all power, which they don't have all power now. Just tell you this one corny story. This is called a not so helpful prayer. Billy had been misbehaving and was sent to his room. After a while, he reemerged and informed his mother that he had thought it over and then said a prayer. His mother said, fine, so you said a prayer about your bad behavior, right? Did you ask God to help you not misbehave in the future? Little Billy said, well, not exactly. I prayed to God that he would help you learn to put up with me. Yeah, help you learn to put up with me. Well, that kind of reminds me, churches and clerics that put up with these new trends are really seemingly justifying it. Because if you are silent and all these things are going on, won't people assume that it's okay with you? And other leaders that have a lot of influence in society. The Marxists unleashed something called social justice. But basically, social justice is from a secular perspective. It's totally unbiblical. A lot of what is social justice undermines God's laws and natural discipline. It may sound good politically, but when you look at it deeply, it's not good. And so we should speak out against it. Some will say, well, what about political idolatry? If you get involved in politics or say anything about any of these issues, aren't you committing political idolatry? And I would say, one is never put a man on a pedestal, any politician. But the big thing to remember is you will never get a utopian government until the second coming of Jesus Christ. Let me say that again. You'll never get a utopian government until the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, is that to say that you can't vote for the better party? Of course not. I would just tell people, look at the party platform and vote for the better platform. Some platforms are for keeping your Second Amendment, staying with the Constitution as it's originally meant. Some platforms are anti-abortion. They're more pro-family. The other party has platforms where they actually booed God when at their meeting. I actually saw it on TV, so I know I'm not making this up. They're secular and anti-God, anti-Israel, pro-abortion, for euthanasia, and a lot of other I would call unbiblical things. But given those two platforms, which party should you vote for? Duh. And we were talking about it last night, and we said, look, certainly pray for America. But as I think Tom said, if this government and this country is chosen by who people vote for, well, pray for the best you can get for America and then vote for the party with the better program. I'm not saying put the leaders up on a pedestal or expect utopia. You will never get utopia in this world. And people who pick on historical figures because they were not perfect show a lack of understanding of history and knowledge. There is nobody perfect. I mean, you pick, well, whatever figure, I won't mention any people because I'll probably upset some people if I mention some of their favorite heroes. Any hero that you could think of, any movie star you think is the greatest whatever, I'll bet you if you could look at their life really closely, there's nobody that's perfect. No politician, no king, no governor, except for Jesus Christ. There's never been a person in the world who was perfect. So appreciate the good things that people did, and don't expect perfection until Christ comes back. But I still want to beg the question: what is worldliness? Because they say, well, you don't want to be worldly. And I know there are churches like the Amish who avoid the modern world. They don't vote. At least most Amish do not use electricity. They don't use motor vehicles, motor tractors, a lot of stuff. They're stuck at about 1880, somewhere around in there. And I'm not against them, and that's fine. But in other words, they have withdrawn from society. They're totally out of it. I don't think that's what the Bible says. Because Paul actually said at one point, he says, if you didn't talk to people who were bad, idolaters and adulterers and other schemes, you'd have to leave the world. He's not telling the Corinthians to leave society. He's just saying we need to behave better ourselves, but you got to deal with the world. I don't think God wants us to withdraw from the world. So you vote for the better party platform. 1 John 2:15. 1 John 2:15. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Now, I think love of the world means the latest trends out of Hollywood, the latest trends in the materialistic group. Got to have more stuff. I would say worldly things are things like euthanasia, abortion up to the point of birth and then beyond, government-sponsored suicide, weakening of family values. That's worldly. I would say you should try and vote and speak against many of these worldly trends. 1 John 2:18. Little children, it is the last hour, and as you have heard, the Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have come, by which we know it is the last hour. Well, what we now know is that scripture would imply that the closer you get to the end time, the more the devil's pressure will get, the more Antichrist will come. That's kind of logical. So anti-Christian forces are getting stronger in society. You can feel it. And it's worse for the younger generation. And they're tricky. The devil is smart. He packages evil so what looks good and good so what looks bad. Like if you watch a lot of movies, I haven't actually seen a lot, but I've read about it. A lot of the villains are regular businessmen, or they're church pastors, or dedicated Christians. They're the new villains. There are even some movies where assassins or hitmen are the hero. I was like, wait a minute, how does that make any sense? Because a hitman is a murderer for hire. But I'm telling you, they say in some movies they're the heroes. You're saying you can't believe it. But the devil is clever. He makes bad look good and good look bad. And if churches are totally silent to all these trends, it makes as if you acquiesce and you agree. When the Roman Empire collapsed from moral decay from within, and they call it the rabble of Rome. Rome, the people got so spoiled and so weak, so immoral, that the Roman Empire had to be guarded by hired outsiders. You can see how that sets you up for a collapse, doesn't it? Their loyalty is not to you. It's only to the money you pay them. One day they're going to think, well, let's go take Rome and take all the money. Well, anyway, the question is, how close is America to such moral rot that this country will decay from within? 1 John 2:17, the world is passing away and the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever. So we can do God's will in two ways. One, support the work that publishes a warning, and there's a lot of stuff in our magazine and on the website that's against the new worldly trends. It may upset you seeing, us talk against all the new worldly trends, but I think they're bad for society. They're anti-Bible and they're anti-principles of God. Though Satan is clever, you may not always see it so clearly. And they make the social justice sound good. But the social justice is based on liberal, secular, anti-biblical policies. They sound good, but they aren't really good. Look at places like California and Seattle, where they've been into that sort of thing for years. Those societies are getting weaker and more bad things are happening. They say a stream of people are moving from California to Texas. And California has probably better natural resources, certainly better weather than Texas, but their policies are disaster for regular people. Number two, personally, if you feel you have an opening and people are going to do bad things, push back. Tell them, in spite of what you might have heard some famous people on TV say or movie stars say, or even preachers of mega churches say, that's not biblical, that's not godly, and try to discourage them from doing it. If we're quiet, we're like the dog, the guard dog that refuses to bark. It'll appear that we're going along with it. And our society is being destroyed for lack of knowledge. And what we mean by lack of knowledge is lack of understanding the Bible. Even in the days of Abraham Lincoln, which may surprise you a little bit, even in the days of Abraham Lincoln, two of his greatest speeches, he mentioned, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Actually, some of those speeches were brilliant when you read it. Everybody in the country knew where he got that from. Pretty much everybody in America had a rudimentary understanding of the Bible. They knew that was from Matthew, and they knew exactly what he meant. I'll bet you, if you read that speech to people today, a lot of them will say, where did he get that from? They wouldn't know. It's from the Bible. And if you read many of the American history, all kinds of presidents, including the great FDR, the liberals' hero, even he quoted the Bible and prayed to God on some of his fireside chats in World War II. That's actually a true statement. You can find it on YouTube. Some were maybe more religious than others, but still, America was a reasonably Bible-oriented society, and God blessed America greatly. And there's no way you can look at American history and not say God was blessing them. Lewis and Clark expedition, 1805, they were lucky to go all the way to the Pacific, map all that out, and that actually includes states like Missouri that we live in now. And only because some things went bad for Napoleon, he sold it to America. $15 million for doubling the size of America. I think actually they bought Florida, and Florida was bigger than it is now when they bought it. It included a lot of the southern parts of Alabama and Mississippi. They bought Florida for $5 million. You know how valuable Florida is? The point I'm making is you see how blessed America was all those years. And I'm not saying we didn't have some good leaders like Jefferson and Washington and Lincoln, but a lot of it was God's blessing. As we get more away from the Bible, more secular, more worldly, more nature worship instead of God worship, those blessings are moving away. It's interesting. It seems like after they took God out of the classroom, America lost its first war, Vietnam. Now, those two things may not have anything to do with each other, but it's just, anyway, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? And education is a big part of why this country is going astray. And it's kind of scary. Hosea 4:6. Hosea 4:6. Now, all these are warnings to Israel before they went into captivity. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And he means biblical and knowledge of Israel's history. Because you've rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being priests for me. Because you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. So it will be especially bad for the next generation if ministers and other leaders and lawyers reject God's law. It's bad for society. Hosea 4:7. The more they increase, the more they sin against me. And then he says their glory will be turned into shame. Prosperity actually, like it did the Roman Empire, can make people weaker. Can actually make people weaker because you look at, this will vary, I'll admit, some kids are much different than others, but for many kids, don't you see how spoiled the younger generation is? I can see it. They give them trophies for losing. We can't let them lose, the poor little darlings. They say you learn more from losing than you do from winning. This is the thought. Hosea 4:14. The last part of that verse says about Israel, the people without discernment are doomed. Unless we get discernment. And you look at things like what happened in Seattle. They allowed, a pretty good chunk of downtown Seattle to be lawless, run by a mob of anarchist and left-wing agitators. And that, obviously it turned into a disaster and the police had to eventually clean them out. But can you see the lack of discernment? And that city is still voting to make drastic cuts in its police force. Same thing in Minnesota, and I believe they're working on it in Chicago and New York. And in some of those cities like New York and Chicago, crime is going up, but policing is going down. Now you're going to say, discernment-wise, what's the logic? Crime is, I think, is it shootings have gone up 150% in New York, and yet they removed the detective section of New York, took the detectives away, and they're going to cut the budget by $1 billion. That's a lot of less police. And the police that are there are demoralized. Crime is going up and policing is going down. You see the logic there, don't you? That city is going to die. Now, I think I do know what some of the radicals want to do. They want to give policing over to the mob. And you think about what happened in the French and Russian Revolution, the police, food police and others. It will actually lead to more cruelty to anybody that disagrees with what they want to do. It's scary. And what bothers me, I used to ask this question in one of my classes, and out of about 60 students, I say, how many of you know the significance of the fall of the Berlin Wall? Usually I have about 2 students raise their hand, and I'd ask them, are you from private schools? And they'd say yes. The ones from public school had no idea. And I said, well, they had to put up a wall to keep the people in the communist empire because it was so horrible. They were starving and no political, they would all escape. So Stalin had to put up a wall. The moment the East German soldiers refused to fire on their own people, it was over. And then the same happened in other countries, including in Russia. It was really a dramatic scene. I remember Boris Yeltsin was with the people, and there were a bunch of tanks surrounding the Russian, their equivalent of a communist party parliament, surrounding the building, and the tanks had their muzzles outward, to fight the public. And they had these little Russian women with flowers walking up to the boys in the tanks and putting flowers, giving them flowers, saying, you're not going to shoot your own people, are you? And the moment the soldiers refused to shoot their own people, it was over. People rushed in there and they killed a lot of the communists and ran them out of the country. And communism collapsed in about 8 weeks. Could that happen in China, by the way? It's possible. By the way, that's why regimes like North Korea and the communists in China have been so ruthless. There's a certain fear that the people might not put up with it. The people are disarmed, but still. And by the way, that very same year, they had demonstration in Tiananmen Square. And according to some of my Chinese students, the Western press didn't get to see most of it. There was a lot of fighting in Beijing and other places. The people really tried hard to kick the communists out, and they brought in soldiers from the west part of China that were more loyal, and they killed a lot of people. The tanks just mowed people down. In other words, communism wasn't as loved as much as you might think it was. Now, I guess they brainwashed their kids in the last few years, but the point I'm getting at is our kids know nothing about the failure of communism. They don't even know about Venezuela, the richest country in Latin America 20 years ago, and now they ate the zoo animals last year. They're starving. And they have Cuban troops there to help them stay in power. It doesn't work, but nobody knows it. The education system is certainly not going to tell people that because they're all socialists to varying degrees. They might not admit it, but that's true. Hosea 4:1-2. Hear the word of Jehovah, you children of Israel. For Jehovah has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land, because there's no truth, nor goodness, nor knowledge of God in the land. Isn't America moving in that direction? If you listen to NBC and CNN, you get the impression there's no knowledge of God or goodness or truth in the land. Then he talks about the stealing and how adultery and they break out and blood touches blood. There are more murders all over the place. So how's America's Bible IQ? It's low and getting lower. One more corny story before I finish. One more corny story. It's called Some Improvements in Hell. This engineer went to hell. He didn't like what was going on there, so he said, I'm going to help out. He installed flush toilets, air conditioning, escalators, and really improved things a lot. So St. Peter asked Satan at one point, how are things going in hell? And Satan says, hey, we got an engineer, we got flush toilets and air conditioning. It's quite wonderful. St. Peter says, wait a minute. You're not supposed to get any engineers. This isn't right. You should send him back up to heaven. Satan says, no way am I letting him go. We enjoy all these goodies down here. St. Peter says, if you don't send him back, I will sue you. And Satan grins and says, yeah, like, where are you going to get a lawyer from? Lawyers are supposed to teach people the law, but you realize, you can see it in the Supreme Court decision, lawyers don't believe many of them, in the actual meaning of the law as it was originally intended. They will call themselves judicial activists. Well, you're not supposed to create laws from the bench. They're supposed to be impartial applicators of the law as it is written. But they're not doing that. And even when a conservative appoints a judge, you notice that the judges tend to drift left. Law schools, same with the clergy. A lot of them don't really believe in the literal second coming of Jesus Christ. And many of our clergy also drifting left. Israel forgot God, and they went into pagan worldliness, nature worship, and then into captivity. So the question is America nearly as bad as Israel before they went into captivity? And I don't have an answer for that. It's hard to tell. There are a lot of good people, but there are a lot of crazy people, and the crazy ones get most of the attention on television, so it's hard to tell, isn't it? What should believers do? I think what we should do is become really strong in our Bible knowledge and appropriate historical knowledge, so that if we are called upon or get an opportunity, we can tell people the truth. And a lot of them don't want to hear it, but if you can, a little bit here and there. 2 Timothy 2:15. Paul writes to Timothy, be diligent to present yourself approved of God, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. In other words, he's saying you really understand the Bible. Because you can misapply the Bible. People do it all the time. In 2 Peter 3:15 and 16, Peter writes and says, Paul's writings are hard to be understood for people who don't understand the Bible. See, if you understand the foundation of the Bible, then you can understand Paul correctly. But he's easy to misunderstand if you don't understand it. My last scripture is Proverbs 24:10. Proverbs 24:10 reads, if you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small. In other words, I'm afraid to say anything. These people might not be so friendly toward me. Rescue those who are being taken away to death, holding back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. And I think what he's saying is, now in many cases you can't prevent people from stumbling into stupid things, but at least you can tell them, you can warn them that the course that you're on, that you want the whole country to go on, is stumbling into disaster. God is saying to believers, really know the Bible. The popular thing is go along with the Marxist, worldly, pagan ways, and God is going to judge them as wrong. Many in the Christian left need to do a lot of repenting because they're either silent or they seem to be going along with these things. But we can, as an organization and as an individual, warn peoples of the danger ahead. We can be the true barking watchdogs.